Hey, Shalom Israel. We're back with part 4 of counting to Shabuot, or the Feast of Weeks. Today we're going to be looking at the 7 Sabbaths. And I'm going to start by reading Leviticus 23, verse 15 from the King James Version. It is written, "And ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete." Remember in part 1 we talked about how this counting to Shavuot is kind of like a time bridge that connects the festival of unleavened bread to the festival of weeks. And within this time bridge, we can see almost like wheels within wheels, or three major components that make up this time bridge. And today we want to look at that inner unit, or the 7 Sabbaths. Now, in order to understand the Sabbaths in question, we got to realize that there are different classes of Sabbaths. And that's why we kind of brought it up in part 1, that in verse 3 it talked about the weekly Sabbath. Then later on it started talking about the high annual Moedim. And I just want to mention those high annual Sabbaths in chapter 23 of Leviticus real quick. The first day of unleavened bread and the last day of unleavened bread are high Sabbaths. The Feast of Weeks is another high Sabbath. The first day of the seventh month, also known as Yom Teruah, Day of Trumpets, is a high Sabbath. The 10th day of the seventh month, the day of Yom Kippurim, Day of Atonement, is a high Sabbath. Matter of fact, it's called the Sabbath of Sabbaths. The first day of Sukkot on the 15th day of the seventh month is also a Sabbath. And Shemini Atzeret, or the 8th day, the 22nd day of the seventh month, is also a Sabbath. And those are the 7 annual high Sabbaths that are throughout the year on Yah's calendar. But we got to understand there's a distinction between the weekly and the annual. I've been kind of repeating this over and over again. The reason why it's important, because especially today, in the very verse we're looking at, it actually mentions both classes of Sabbaths in the same verse. As we read again the beginning of this verse, it says, "And ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath." This phrase, morrow after the Sabbath, was already mentioned in verse 11 up above when we looked at the scripture version versus the Septuagint. The Septuagint used the morrow of the first day, making reference to the first day of unleavened bread, where the scripture version had the morrow after the Sabbath. And if a lot of people aren't aware that the first day of unleavened bread is a Sabbath, they could be confused. But nevertheless, we discovered by looking at the Septuagint, the book of Joshua, and we'll look at more proof texts, even more today, 4 more proofs that show that the Sabbath in question is actually the first day of unleavened bread. But this Sabbath here, yeah, it is the first day of unleavened bread. So the morrow after the Sabbath is referring to the 16th. So again, this says, "Ye shall count." So we're counting. What are we counting this time? We're counting 7 Sabbaths shall be complete or perfect. The 7 Sabbaths that are mentioned are the weekly Sabbaths. So the first Sabbath is referring to the high Sabbath. The 7 Sabbaths are referring to weekly Sabbaths. And how do we know this? Well, the Hebrew language in this verse kind of bears this out. Daniel Gregg does an awesome job at kind of explaining the distinction between these Sabbaths. I'm just going to read a quote from him. "The next part of counting is to count 7 Sabbaths. They shall be perfect." The word perfect or complete is tamimot. This is a further indication of counting the seventh day. Since 7 is the number of perfection, wholeness, and completion, it says they shall be perfect, tamimot. This language is to specify to count only the 7 days. The seventh day of unleavened bread is also a Sabbath, as is the first day of unleavened bread. But these Sabbaths are not counted. They are not perfect 7 days according to creation, which fall in a perfect, unbroken cycle of 7 days. And I think that is really key, this word tamimot, or perfect, and tying it back to creation. Meaning, it in the language, it sets apart these 7 Sabbaths from the first Sabbath mentioned. And you may be wondering, is there proof in the scripture? Can we see scriptural proof of these 7 Sabbaths, and that we distinguish them, and then we use the high Sabbath of the 15th for the first Sabbath in the verse. And I would say yes, there is proof, and we're going to look at it here in a second, but it ties into the death, burial, and the resurrection of Yahushua Messiah. We've already done a teaching series on the Sabbath resurrection made simple, but in case you haven't seen that, I'll just sum it up real quick. The scripture tells us in the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that the resurrection of Yahushua Messiah occurred on Mia Sabbaton. That is the first of 7 Sabbaths counting up to Shabuot. This directly links into the verse we're looking at today in Leviticus 23:15, where it tells us, "Ye shall count 7 Sabbaths." Messiah came out of the grave on the first of those 7 Sabbaths. Now, this occurred in 34 CE when Passover landed dead smack in the middle of the week. And after 3 days and 3 nights, on the third day of unleavened bread, which is the 17th day of the first month, on Mia Sabbaton, the first of the 7 Sabbaths, Yahushua Messiah came out of the grave. Now, this chart that I have to the left of the screen here is actually an Omer counter chart for 2020, this very year. And you can see that Passover this year also landed in the middle of the week with the 17th being on Shabbat, just like it did in 34 CE. And this can be good just to kind of give it a visual on the first all the way down to the 7th Sabbath. And what I wanted to bring up is that not only does the scripture tell us when the resurrection happened, but by understanding that, it's a massive proof text in all 4 accounts that the Omer account starts on the 16th. And let me explain. In order to have the 17th being the first Sabbath, you would have to start your account on the 16th. The Sabbath, the first Sabbath mentioned there on the morrow after the Sabbath would have been the 15th, the high Sabbath of the 15th, which we've already talked about, the first day of unleavened bread, which is one of those high Sabbaths. The morrow after, the 16th, that's when ye shall count. And the 17th is the first of those 7 Sabbaths that we need to count. Now, this is a major problem for people in the Hebrew roots movement that follow a Sadducee reckoning of counting the Omer, because they can't claim that Messiah rose on Mia Sabbaton. They may say he rose on Sabbath, but they specifically don't say first Sabbath because of the way they understand the Omer. Because that if they understood that first Sabbath as the weekly Sabbath, the morrow after would have been actually the 18th or the first day of the week, which their first Sabbath would have happened on the 24th of that month. However, the scripture tells us it was on the Messiah rose on Mia Sabbaton, the first of the Sabbath. So it can be extremely helpful not only understanding the death, burial, and resurrection of Yahushua Messiah, but also knowing how to count to Shabuot with the festival weeks and when that count actually starts, which is on the 16th day of the first month. When we come back, we'll be looking at verse 16, which will tie in the 7 weeks to these 7 Sabbaths to help us better understand the counting to Shavuot. Shalom.